All right, if you got a Bible this morning, I hope that you do, go ahead and grab it. And we're in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, chapter 33, Genesis 33. And we are, as you guys know, making our way through really snapshots and scenes from the story of the life of Jacob, this third of the patriarchs, the grandson of Abraham, to whom the covenant promises were given, and the son of Isaac, the brother of his twin Esau. And we have again and again, week after week, been exploring who he is and how he is not a hero of the faith, not a champion of righteousness and justice, how he had feet of clay, a soul soiled continually by transgression, and how he was constantly in need 4,000 years ago of the exact same thing that you and I are constantly in need of today, and that is the overwhelming radical grace of God to each one of our lives. If you're new to redemption, this is our theme. This is we're endeavoring to be a movement for everyone to understand and to experience the radical grace of Jesus Christ. Because it's our only hope in the world. So you don't have to walk in here and pretend to be something that you're not. We all kind of know what you are already. But we know more importantly who Jesus is and what he has done for us and what he continues to do for us. And so we're exploring that from the life of this third patriarch. And we have just 2 weeks left in this study, because even though his story will take us to the end of the book of Genesis, really the saga of Joseph, his favored son, picks up shortly upon the pages of the story that we're reading this morning. A few years ago, so I try to be honest with you guys, as honest as I can be, about my own issues, and of which there are many. And so a few years ago now, was doing youth work. I've always kind of done youth work in conjunction with lead pastor work. And we were hosting the youth group at my house during this particular season. There was some renovation going on in our old church building. And so we were hosting the youth group at my house. So 30 or 40 teenagers would descend upon our home on Wednesday evenings. And I would teach them. They would play pool. And they would stress me out because they'd have all their drinks around the pool table and they don't know how to play pool correctly. But anyway, you're trying to be righteous and selfless and humble. And so you're like, yeah, just ruin my pool table. And then they, all kinds of stuff that would go on in the house, and they broke all sorts of things during that season. But there was one particular girl who was coming to our youth group at the time. She went to Dunedin High School. She was a senior in high school. Very attractive young lady, very popular young lady, liked by a lot of the boys, and a young lady that, like all of us, had immense issues, but hers were more on the surface. They were more glaring. They were of a certain rebellious type within her that caused drama and mayhem at times within the youth group. And so myself and the other leaders, we had our eye on this young lady. She was very nice, very sweet girl, but problems, okay, kind of followed her wherever she went. And she manufactured those. And so one particular night, she's there at youth group. And look, you don't have to come up and lecture me afterwards about how you shouldn't talk about other people. I know it, that you shouldn't talk about people. But oftentimes in the church, if I'm just honest, we mask our concern for people, or I would say the mask is concern for people, and what we're masking is gossip and a superiority complex that we have as we look down upon other people. And perhaps that was the case with myself and the other youth leaders, because this particular night, the young lady showed up at my house for youth group, and she was in, even for her, rare spirits, demanding all the attention of the room. And we had wondered if there was, which was confirmed later, some drug use that was going on. And so haphazardly, probably, if I'm just honest and confessional this morning, more as a jest about at the young lady's expense than out of true care for her soul, I composed a text right when youth group was starting down. People are still playing pool and they're still hanging out in the house. And I composed a text to a couple of my youth leaders. And I'm like, oh, this girl is in rare form tonight. I wonder what she's on. And I sent it. And I went about my evening. About 3 minutes after I sent it, phone call starts coming in on my phone from the young lady's dad. I'm like, why is he calling me? And I kind of ignore it. And then it comes again and again. And I'm like, what is going on? And I check my text messages, and the thread I had composed to send to my youth workers, I had sent to her. I don't know if this has ever happened to you where you're like, you're kind of in a scattered frame of mind. I had sent it to her. And so this girl I'm supposed to be like caring for and taking care of, now there's this awkward explosion of what am I going to do? How am I going to fix this? The guy's showing up at my house, the dad, and he's furious, and I'm trying to explain, I'm trying to lie my way through because now it's awkward and it's weird. And I've compromised myself, and I've put myself in this position where I'm not paying attention. You're like, man, you are one to be looked down upon. And you're correct. And so are you. I just said it. I prefaced the whole sermon with this. That we make these kind of mistakes, and oftentimes they're more than mistakes. They're transgressions. And what do? Well, it's clear from the story. It's clear from all of our lives. These transgressions, these idiosyncrasies, these misjudgments, they fracture relationship. And as we sit here this morning in this room, we have to admit to ourselves, unless you're just one of those people that God graced with like the most incredible, perfect personality of all time, which then you got your own issues, pride of which is not the least. Like all of us have fractured relationships in our lives. And all of us, if we're honest, love to play the victim card. Even if most of us in this room are like, I would never. We still have this, and maybe we actually are a victim, but there's been a fractured relationship that has formed in our lives because of something someone else has done to us or something we have done to them, and now we have family members, and we have coworkers, and we have friends, and we have neighbors who we refuse to talk to, and we refuse to look at, and we don't have to travel far in our imagination to conjure up who those people, who that person is. Well, for Jacob, that was Esau. I mean, it was Isaac for a little while, because he had deceived his father in Genesis chapter 26, but primarily it's his twin brother Esau, who came out just a few minutes before Jacob, who's the older brother, and in antiquity, especially in a patriarchal culture like this, Esau was the one to receive the birthright and the blessings. He's of covenant relationship to the family, representative of the family. And through acts of atrocity and deceit, Jacob had stolen, humanly speaking, even though he had received from the divine the blessing and the birthright, he had stolen, humanly speaking. He had gone about it in shady ways, and he had fractured the relationship with his brother, which seems from Genesis 25 to have never been that good in the first place. Esau is this man's man. As a matter of fact, as you kind of look at the lineage and the legacy of Esau, I mentioned this in the first week, the narrator of the story clearly likes Esau better than Jacob. All of us like Jacob more, and the only explainable reason for this is because he's the patriarch, and he's the father of Joseph, and he is in the line of Jesus. But when you read the story, Jacob is shady and manipulative and a mama's boy. He's a whiner and a complainer. He's hypocritical. He's like, you deceived me, after he's just deceived his father and his brother. And Esau is the man's man. He's the hunter. He's the warrior. He's the baby born with the beard, right? Like we saw that. His parents literally named him Hairy because he's so hairy at birth when he's born. And so and as we come to Genesis chapter 33, it's been more than 2 decades now since Jacob's atrocities against his brother, stealing by deceit, by shady business, the blessing and the birthright, and then running 450 miles away, getting married, 4 wives, multiple kids, flocks and herds, wealth beyond measure. And then God instructs them to return after more than 20 years to encounter again his family, specifically Esau. His father and mother are gone. And we saw last week that on the return, Jacob is afraid, and he cries out to the Lord, and then he wrestles all night with the angel of the Lord. That was chapter 32. And now after wrestling all night, and you can see the scene, this tense moment that's developing as Jacob, his hip popped from its sockets, irreparably, permanently maimed, debilitated, will walk with a limp the rest of his life. He trudges across the river there to encounter his brother. And this is where we pick up on the story, and we're just going to do what we typically do. We're going to read through, and there's some sub-themes we're going to see this morning from Genesis 33, and there's a couple primary themes we're going to see, all right? So here we go, Genesis chapter 33, verse number 1. Now, Jacob, very interesting. If you're not paying attention, you might not notice this. It might not ring a bell. But Jacob, it says, which is significant because in the preceding verses, his name has been changed. His identity has been altered. As a matter of fact, as you progress through the rest of Jacob's life, through the book of Genesis, the next 16 chapters here, you find that Jacob is referred to 23 times by the name Israel, his renamed moniker, and 45 times by his name from birth, Jacob, which means deceiver. And so even though he's been renamed, he's still struggling with who he is at his core, and that struggle seems to continue throughout his life. Jacob looks up and saw Esau coming toward him with 400 men. Now, in antiquity, we think of 400 men today as like not that much. It's basically a brigade or a platoon or whatever it might be. Like not that big of a deal, 400 men. That's not insurmountable odds potentially. But here you have one guy and you got his servants and his slaves and his wives and his children. And in antiquity, 400 men was a small army. And he sees them coming toward him, marching on him. And all of a sudden, you can imagine, it doesn't say this, once again, Hebrew is very scant in its descriptions oftentimes, but you can begin to imagine that Jacob here is all of the sleepless nights leading up to this point are flooding his mind. He's exhausted, he's maimed, he's remembering the promise, the oath that his brother swore that when my father Isaac dies, I will kill Jacob. He's remembering his mom, who was the only person in his life who ever loved him, who he would never see again, who sent him away out of protection for him. Go 450 miles to a different land and find my brother and hang out there. Just live your life there, because if you come back, you're going to die. And so he sees here approaching him 400 men, and he's overwhelmed with fear. If this is the first time reading or hearing the story, if you were seeing this in film depiction, you would feel the tenseness of the moments. Insurmountable odds. And so he sees them from afar, and so he put the slaves and their children first. Then Leah, by far and away his second favorite wife, distantly removed from the beautiful Rachel, who he left last. Still shady. Still shady. He's like, okay, you slave girls, y'all go first with your kids. And if the 400 men try to wipe y'all out, then Leah will be there as a buffer. Ugly Leah. So that my beautiful Rachel will be last, and hopefully she and my favorite son Joseph can get away. That's literally what's going on. He himself went on ahead and bowed to the ground 7 times. Now, this is very customary during that period of time. You would bow out of reverence or respect or deference or honor. But here he does it 7 times. So the picture is he sees Esau, he divides up his family, and he walks forward and he bows down and he gets up and he walks 2 more steps and he bows down again, gets up, walks, bows down again 7 times. Now, you don't have to be a Bible scholar or have that much experience with the Old Testament to know that the number 7 throughout Scripture is significance. It's the number of completion, or oftentimes perfection. It begins at the very starts, at the arche, with the 7 days of creation. That God, for whatever reason, it's inexplicable, took 7 days to complete his handiwork. He could have done it on a second, but 7 days spread out. You have the nation of Israel later on in the book of Joshua marching 7 times around the walls of Jericho. You have Naaman washing 7 times in the river to be cured of leprosy. And so again, I mean, like you just see this as a very common, almost redundant theme throughout. And so Jacob here bowing 7 times would have signified to his brother Esau that my contrition, my expression of remorse is complete. Like I'm humbling myself, I'm coming before you, I really have no other choice in the matter because you're about to kill me with your 400 men. And so I'm bowing myself to the ground. And what we really see here is the first sub-theme, and that is extreme fear, right? It's right on the surface, extreme fear on the part of Jacob. And why would he not be afraid? Small army approaching him, the threat of death looming over him. This extreme fear. When I think of extreme fear, and particularly extreme nonsensical, irrational, absurd fear, my mind goes back, now it's crazy to think about, almost a quarter of a century. The year was 1998 when we received word that the world would end at the stroke of midnight. And when the year 2000 came, because apparently IBM didn't know how to make a computer that could compute. with the year 2000. I'm not even kidding. It's hard now. Like we laugh at this. Like some of us were freaking out. Some of you are still living on that grain that you stored up in those beans, right? Like you still are. You're like, I'm waiting for it. It's still coming. So I get it. But I remember that. Like it was so like, I remember sitting there as like a senior in high school going, my gosh, all of my dreams are going to be ruined. Like we're going to be living like animals, like just animals, because the computers don't know what's going on. And everything's going to fail and the world's going to fall apart. And I remember the night that's going to happen. Now I'm sitting there, me and Nate, if you know Nate, he comes here, my brother, and we have like this bravado. His is probably genuine. Mine was false bravado. I'm like, nothing's going to happen, right? But I'm sitting there still like worried and anxious. Meanwhile, my mom and dad, they have drums of water in the garage. And my dad is one of those guys to this day, 24 years later. He doesn't throw away anything, so he still has those drums of water in his garage. And they have like stuff, like bread makers, like homemade, you grind it and turn the butter and all this stuff. I mean, it wasn't really hard for us. We basically were Amish growing up. So like we kind of understood like what was going on, but this was like if you're newer, like, or maybe you're Gen Z, okay, you're Gen Z, which means basically you don't really have a recollection of the World Trade Center's dropping. That's when Gen Z basically begins. You were 5 or 6 when that took place. You have no idea what I'm talking about, and this seems completely confounded and absurd, but let's just be honest here for a second. If you're Gen Z, and I love you, or if you have somebody in your family who's Gen Z is the most anxious, fearful generation of all time. So you can't make fun of us, okay? We can't make fun of each other. We live in this incredibly, I would call it paralytic age, where we are just paralyzed with fear. And most sociologists have concluded that 85% of the things we fear will never actually take place. Much like Jacob's fear here, it was grounded in reality and an oath to him. And yet he was so worked up and he was so overcome with this terror. And then as we're about to see, it came to nothing. Corrie ten Boom famously said, worry or projected fear to the future does not rob tomorrow of sorrow, but it robs today of strength. It does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow. Like living in the past or living in the future, it doesn't actually negates or eradicates what we might worry about, what we might fear. But what it does do is it empties right here and now. Some of us enter this room this morning overwhelmed with what is going to happen as if we know that it's going to happen. And we're robbed right now of comfort and joy and purpose. And you might be like, well, that was easy for Corrie ten Boom to say. Well, if you don't know Corrie ten Boom, she was arrested with her family for hiding Jews in the early 1940s. She and her entire family were taken to Nazi concentration camps in Poland. And all of her family barbarically suffered and died at the hands of the Germans. This is a woman who experienced immense trauma, immense grief, loss, and yet can look forward and go, worry and projected fear does not empty tomorrow of whatever's coming, that sorrow, but it does empty today of its strength. And so that's just a sub-theme that we see here and that we hopefully can learn from. We know this, right? We know it, 2 Timothy 1:7, like some of us memorized it in Awana or whatever Bible club we were part of, but God has not given to his people the spirit of fear. That's not just something that's like a cool little thing that we can hang up in our homes or that our kids can paint on the back of a paper plate. Like, he's not given us the spirit of fear. That is not sourced from Christ. There's caution and there's wisdom, there's prudence, but not fear, but of power, love, and of a sound mind. We could break that apart, and at some point in time we will. But this is what he's taught us too. So Jacob here is not walking in the proper fear and awe of the Lord. He is walking in a crippled paralysis concerning his brother. Verse number 4, but Jacob ran to meet him. That would have been a freak out moment. After Jacob has bowed down 7 times, Esau, armed to the teeth seemingly, because this is how he lives, he goes to bed with his dagger, bloodied, and he's running toward Jacob to encounter Jacob. And for a moment, the fear seemingly tightens its vice grip, no doubt, on Jacob's heart, and hugged him. We don't know what's going on here. We don't know why Esau doesn't seem like a hugger. okay? He doesn't seem like a hugger, but it gets even more weird. Threw his arms around him and kissed him. I haven't seen you forever. All the bad times are forgotten. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. And then they wept. This is not what you're expecting, maybe from Jacob. He seems like a hugger and a kisser and a weeper, but not from Esau. And when Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he asked, "Who are these with you?" Or in other words, how the heck did you get 4 wives? Like how did this happen? And Jacob answered, "The children God has graciously given your servants," saying all the right things. Then the slaves and their children approached him and bowed down, reverence and honor on the part of the family. Leah and her children also approached and bowed down. And then Joseph and Rachel approached and bowed down. And Esau said, "What do you mean by this whole procession I met?" So it's not just your family members, your wives and your children, but out in front there's bushels of grain. There's livestock, and it was clearly manifested as a gift. It was supposed to be a gift. And Esau said, "What is the meaning of this?" And Jacob says, "To find favor with you, my Lord." Or that word favor there, you probably know this. It's from the root hesed. It means grace in the Old Testament. I need grace from you. I need to find this grace from you. So I brought all this stuff to get from you favor or grace or love. And Esau replied, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have." But Jacob said, "No, please, I have found favor. If I found grace with you, if you care about me at all, take this gift from me. For indeed, I've seen your face, and it is like seeing God's face." Now he's going a little far. "Since you have accepted me, please take my present that was brought to you, because God has been gracious to me, and I have everything I need." So Jacob urged him until Esau accepted it. Now, a second sub-theme that emerges here, it's pretty obvious, and this is where we began this morning, is with the idea of there's this awkwardness, there's this broken relationship, a fracture has taken place, animosity and hatred and threats have ensued, and now we see, at least on the surface, reconciliation taking place. And it's something we just need to learn from. And I think there's some principles to be followed here. 3 principles. We see one principle that's conspicuously absent, all right? So you study the text here a little bit, and what do we see in the passage? Well, 4 things. Number 1 is humility. Maybe it's false humility. It seems as we're going to go along here that's at least in part false humility. But you see humility on the part of Jacob. He's approaching somebody he's wronged, and instead of playing the victim, "You always picked on me. You always put me in a headlock when we were growing up. I remember those swirlies that you did in Dad's outhouse. I remember these things." Instead of playing the victim card, he's saying, "You know what? No, I've wronged my brother. I've transgressed against him. And I'm showing deference. I'm showing humility." I was talking to, Thursday night, a few of us met at a brewery over in Clearwater, and I was talking to some of the guys and ladies who were there, and I said, we're counting this last week. We had a lady here in our church who passed away, and going to visit her and then kind of reaching out to different people there's been kind of somewhat of a fractured relationship with, and how I didn't receive the response that I would like to receive. And so my words to my friends sitting around at the brewery the other night was, you know what? Being vindictive is so much easier than being gracious. And I'm not saying myself up as if I'm typically gracious. It takes a lot of work. But when you put yourself out there, and when you try to humble yourself, and when you try to be gracious, there is nothing like that being spurned and run over. And there's nothing like that being spurned and run over to reveal if our hearts were actually humble and gracious, or if it was all a false front. It's easier. I talked about last week, my melanoma and skin cancer and it being cut out to save my life. It would have been easier just to leave it there temporarily, momentarily. It would have been just easier. It's easier, right? It's easier just to not be healthy. It's easier to leave and be I'm going to go get Pizza Hut today or Taco Bell, if you're like me. I'm going to lay in bed all day. I'm not going to get any exercise. I'm not going to go out in the sun. I'm not going to get adequate sleep. I'm going to stay up all night reading or playing video games or whatever. It's easy. That's just easier momentarily. It's crippling long term. The same is true with pride and humility. And as Lewis famously said, and most of us know this, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. So it's not this self-pity. Oh, I'm so terrible. It's just disregarding my desires and pursue the desires of others. That's hard to do. And yet it's the right thing to do. It's the thing that honors God. It is what is actually best for us. Humility is the first principle we see. If we want to reconcile, you have a relationship in your life. Let's just be honest. You have a relationship in your life that is fractured. That's bad news. It's not take humility. You're like, well, they hurt me. It's still going to take humility. It's going to take humility. A second thing that we're just going to take, this is the one that we don't see here in the passage, is confession. Jacob never actually admits what he did wrong. That's why it would seem, as you continue reading here, that their reconciliation is short-lived. It's not legitimate. One of the reasons it's probably short-lived. He doesn't actually admit, hey, this is what I did that's wrong. Maybe he did. Maybe he would want to, and Esau would be like, hey, well, you know what? You're going to do it again. Maybe that's somebody in your life. They're going to come to you and say, hey, this is what I did wrong, in humility, in deference. Or maybe you're going to say it to them, and the response to them, you're going to do it again. At that moment, probably we need to say, yeah, I probably will. But that doesn't negate the fact that I am sorry now for the transgression I've committed. You don't see confession here on the part of Jacob. You should see that. Number three, a third thing that you do see on the part of Jacob is sacrifice. It's going to take some time, potentially resources, to make up for the deficit that I have caused or that you have caused for someone. And that's going to feel like sacrifice. It might even feel like death to a certain degree. But Jacob here puts out his flocks and his herds and his resources. A final thing that we see here is from the life of Esau, really. We don't know how or why, but Esau says, I have enough. There's perspective. And I don't need more. I don't need all this stuff. I have enough. These are the steps that make for godly reconciliation. We see, you study the pages of Scripture, church history, we could see this in numerous places, but I think the most glaring result is a passage that we studied late last year, and that was from Genesis, book of Genesis chapter 50, when Joseph, who's the favored son of Jacob, tells his brothers who betrayed him, you might wonder where they got that from. All Jacob's sons betrayed Jacob's favored son, sold him into slavery in Egypt. You know the story probably. And after years and years, after more than 2 decades, Joseph is raised to a place of prominence and saves his family. And his brothers come to him and apologize when Jacob is now having passed. And Joseph says to them, am I not in the place of God? I'm right where God wanted me to be. You meant evil against me, God meant it for good. There's perspective that takes place, a godly, divine perspective when reconciliation needs to take place. This is a second sub-theme we say here. So much more could be said about this, but what we understand in the text is confession is important. That's absent here. Sacrifice and humility and godly, divine perspective. These things are important if we're going to actually experience reconciliation. It's easier to let the bitterness continue to fester. It will only lead to death in almost every way. So, reconciliation takes place, at least on the surface, between the two brothers. Then Esau, verse number 12, now says, let's move on, and I'll go ahead of you. So they've met kind of in the middle, between Padam Aram and where Jacob now lives in Seir. And Jacob replied, my Lord knows that the children, my little boys and my one little girl, they're weak. I have nursing flocks and herds. If they are driven hard for one day, the whole herd will die. Let my Lord go ahead of his servant. I will continue on slowly at a pace suited to the livestock and the children until I come to my Lord at Seir. Esau said, leave me alone, or let me leave some of my people with you. Some of my warriors, they're going to help you. They'll protect you. But Jacob replied, why do that? Please indulge me, my Lord. Just do what I say. And that day Esau, blockhead as he is, started on his way back to Seir. But Jacob went to Succoth. He built a house for himself and shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. Succoth means booths. So they're not like actual brick and mortar homes, but they're far more than tents. After Jacob came from Padam Aram, he arrived safely at Shechem in the land of Canaan and camped in front of the city of Shechem. He purchased a section of the field where he had pitched his tent from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of silver, and he set up an altar there and called it El, the Elohim of Israel. Or in other words, like he builds an altar there. He builds like a little church, a little sanctuary in our day. And he says, this is a sanctuary of God, the God of Yahweh provides. Like that's how we would understand that. So on the surface, things are going well, right? He finished down chapter 33. It's like, okay, he's reconciled to his brother. He's showing some signs of humility here. He's worshiping God at the end of the chapter. Aaron, I thought you said there was nothing to be learned positively from Jacob's life. Well, I hate to do it to you guys again, but we have to unpack this chapter just really briefly and understand what's going on here, because what do we see on the surface of Jacob's life? Well, humility and worship. What do you see if you do any biblical legwork whatsoever? You see deceit and disobedience. His worship is just a mask for his disobedience. And that should sound familiar. That should connect with us and convict us. So how is deceit? I've already said that Jacob, his name has been changed to Israel. Jacob means deceiver. Israel means Yahweh provides. Me and my kids were in Culver's the other day. It's their favorite restaurant. They love going to Culver's. They love the cheese turds and the ice cream and everything unhealthy. And so we go into Culver's. It's just me and the kids. Danielle's at home, and I'm buying them Culver's, and we're sitting there. I love my kids. I don't know if you're a parent here, maybe this is why you come to my church. One of the reasons is because I am not a big fan of other children. Okay? Serve in the children's ministry, okay? But I'm not a huge fan. I mean, they're cute, they're cool, they're little devils, but I love my kids. My kids are awesome. I love hanging out with them. And so hanging out with them. And when you're a parent, at times, you kind of grow tolerant of things that are super annoying to everyone else. And if you're not me, you're the worst of the bunch, okay? You're so tolerant, you don't even see it. And so I'm sure that my kids are causing disturbance. I just kind of let them go up to the drink machine and make all their little concoctions and then come back and taste it, and it's disgusting. They go back and pour it out, and they're making a mess. But a couple of tables away from us, there's this family sitting there, and it looks like grandparents and mom. She has a newborn baby, and then she has a 3-year-old, and this 3-year-old's having a meltdown. Okay, whatever. 3-year-olds have meltdowns. But the parents are doing this thing that I hate. And so I'm be honest, I hate it. I'm a grace guy, except in certain situations, and this is one of them. They're counting. I know. Okay? If you're I count. The only thing you should count is licks on the rear end with a belt. Okay? I'm just kidding. I'm joking. But they're counting. They're hey, if you don't stop right now, 1, 2. I'm how long are we gonna go? 17, 24, let's just keep going with this bad boy. And so in that moment, I'm sitting there, I'm kind of frustrated. I'm y'all are ruining my butter burger and this experience here at Culver's. And I'm also thinking to myself, when we count or whatever we might do, we're all jacking up our kids probably at the end of the day, but whatever we do with them, especially when we do things that are not actually beneficial for them, all we're doing is we're teaching them further deceit. Okay, this is not a parental course, by the way, okay? But what we're doing, and that's what we're doing with one another oftentimes. When we put up with bad behavior, when we pretend that we don't see what's actually going on, we're enabling further deceit in our own lives and in the lives of others around us. Jacob here is being deceitful. How do we know this? Okay, we know it. It's really, really clear. I've got a map for you. I know it's going to be washed out this morning. It'll also be available online if you're watching on YouTube or you want to watch again later on. This is the land of Israel. You can tell by the Sea of Galilee, the one blue splotch up at the top, and the Dead Sea down at the bottom. And there's some lines here. I'm going to explain what they are. You probably can't see them very, very well. But down in the far left corner of the screen is a town called now modern-day Beersheba. This is where Isaac and Rebekah and Esau and Jacob would have lived when Jacob betrayed and deceived his brother and his father, and he fled. He flees up past Jerusalem, past Jericho, which would be on his right-hand side, around the banks of the Jordan River. And you see kind of faintly, most of you, the red line that ascends above the Sea of Galilee and up into the Golan Heights and all the way up to Padam Aram at the top. This is where his relatives live. This is where he meets Leah and Rachel. And this is where he lives for more than 2 decades. Meanwhile, down at the very bottom in the right-hand corner is Seir. This is where Esau has moved to. This will become the home place of the Edomites. Now, there's a point to all of this. When Esau receives word that Jacob is descending now after 20 plus years to meet him, Esau with his 400 men ascend to the north to greet him. Welcoming party. They converge a couple hundred miles from each of their own homes there in the center of the stream. And when they converge, these pleasantries are exchanged in Genesis chapter 22. And then Esau says what? We saw it in the text. Hey, come on with me back down to Seir, down here at the bottom. I have my home, I have my spread, you can live here, we can live together, we'll be brothers once more. And what does Jacob say? Go on ahead. I'll be there shortly. Like, all right, just, well, I don't want to leave some warriors with you, some cooks with you. Like, I got to take care of your whole clan. No, we'll be fine. You go on ahead. And so Esau returns to Seir, and Jacob, the deceiver, does a hard right turn and moves over to the Shephelah, which is a series of fertile valleys right there north of Jerusalem, where David, a few centuries later, would slay Goliath, and sets up shop in Shechem with no intent on ever going to Seir. And he doesn't do this, even though he has told his brother, that's why I call Esau a blockhead. Apparently Esau has learned nothing in 20 plus years. I'm just going to trust him again. He'll follow me to Seir. He goes back to Seir, and Jacob banks off to the right and ends up in Shechem. So we see deceit. Now, I'll just make one final point about this before we wrap down this morning. This deceit that you see in Jacob's life after just wrestling the night before with God, after experiences and encounters of worship, after his name and identity being altered, you're no longer deceiver, heel grabber, conniver. You are the friend of God. You're the one who Yahweh protects and provides for. We see this conundrum or this struggle in the life of Jacob that we can all, if you've trusted in Jesus here, you've been redeemed, that we all can identify with. It's what Martin Luther, the reformer, would call in the Latin, simul justus et peccator, which just means simultaneously, we all in Christ understand and live in two realities. Justification, meaning that we are as righteous now as Jesus Christ is, and sinful. Simul justus, justified et peccator, and sinful. Simultaneously justified and sinful. Like, this is a conundrum for us. This rattles our mind. What does it mean? Like, how can these two things be true? People come up all the time and be like, well, you called us a sinner. I'm not a sinner anymore. I'm a saint. And I'm like, well, good for you. I'm a saint too. And I'm also still at the same time a sinner. Because practically speaking, I still sin and I'm still screwed up and I'm still jacked up every single day. And I'm still filled with deceit and hypocrisy. Yet positionally before God as a son of righteousness, he sees me as he sees Jesus, which is an act of pure grace. And he's practically making me a little bit better all the time from the inside out. That's the reality of our souls. And we see that here in Jacob. And so once again, I at least find a little bit of comfort in Jacob. So I'm like, this is a guy whose name has been changed. He's encountered God in a way that none of us have. We haven't wrestled with him all night long physically. His name has been altered. Your righteousness now. You're the one that Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, protects. Your name is now Israel. And yet he's still deceitful. And he's worshiping in spite of his brokenness. And even his worship is laced with hypocrisy at times. And so we understand, like, if there's hope for somebody like Jacob, there's hope for us. What about disobedience? Okay, so he's deceiving his brother, but he's also, more importantly, disobeying God. How do we see that here in the text? Well, it's pretty clear. You go back in Genesis, if you do some legwork, and you see where God says to Abraham and to Isaac, do not build houses, homes in the land of the Canaanites. Do not assimilate to their culture. Like tents. You're going to live in tents. You're sojourners here. It's symbolic. For generations, you're going to live in tents. What does Jacob do? Deceives his brother, makes his way over to Shechem, and builds houses, sets up shop, assimilates the culture. And if you haven't read Genesis chapter 34 in a while, I would encourage you to do so. It's a wake-up call of what happens by God's grace to the people of his grace when they disobey him. Jacob has all these boys, household boys. He has one girl. This one girl, Dinah, goes out riding. She's seen by who? The prince of Shechem. He takes her, he rapes her, he falls in love with her. Jacob is a wimp, no surprise, says, okay, yeah, sure, you can marry her. Jacob's second and third sons, Simeon and Levi, say, And so they converse with the leaders of Shechem, with the king and with the prince who has raped Dinah. And they say, okay, look, how about this? You can have her as a wife if you follow the ways of Israel and you and all the male inhabitants of your city get circumcised. Saw in chapter 34. And so Shechem, the boy, the prince of Shechem, is saying, that sounds awesome. So they all go back, they get circumcised. And a couple of days when everyone is sore and laid up, Simeon and Levi, presumably with a couple other men, a few band of brothers, take their swords and they go in and they literally slaughter the entire city of Shechemites. It's barbaric, it's kind of glorious, it's trespass. And they bring this shame and they bring this disgrace and they amplify the fear in Jacob's life. And all of this takes place. We have to understand this. This does not, hear me say this does not change Jacob's identity. Doesn't change who he is. And yet at the same time, there are very real social and physical and familial consequences to his disobedience before the Lord. And so we just need to pause there and hear that as well. We identify with Jacob. Hopefully we learn from Jacob. Ultimately this morning, the hope of the story comes back to the one who's going to come through the seed, through the line of Jacob 2,000 years later. We see him. We see hints of him here in these moments. We understand that just like Jacob deceived Esau to try to get from Esau what only Esau actually, humanly speaking, deserved, we too, as representatives of Jacob, try our best to pry from the fingers of God the glory, position, honor, and name that only he deserves. That's what we do. And so there's a breach in relationship. And God has said the soul that sins justly will die. And yet there's reconciliation that takes place. How? Well, we see it in Esau. We see it when Esau says, I have enough. Like some of us want to come before God, we begin to feel the haunting void of this fracture of relationship. And so we want to come before God and say, hey, take all of this stuff. Here is everything. And God says back to us in full of compassion, I have everything I need. I don't need your bribes. To love you, I don't need your obedience. I don't need your submission. I don't need your good behaviors. I don't need any of that stuff. I have all that I need because my son, in a far more significant way than Jacob, condescended and humbled himself again and again and again and again to satisfy divine justice. This is what's called substitutionary atonement, that Christ stood in our place, representing us and atoned for or covered our sins. He bore humility, much like we see in the person, falsely in the person of Jacob. So the father could say, much like Esau does, I have all that I need. I don't need anything else from you. Like this is it. Like this is, we were at the park the other day. I took the two youngest up to the parks. First one was doing homework. And there's this little teeny baby bluebird there on the ground, just like sitting there in the mulch. And at first, I almost stumble over. I almost step on it. And then I see it, so I call my two youngest over, and we're kind of poking it with a little twig nicely, gently, to try to get it to move. And there's something wrong with its wings. It probably fell out of the tree, and now it's dehydrated, and it's barely moving. Its eyes are closing. And I kind of knew what was going to happen, okay? You know what's going to happen to this little guy. And so I'm like, I'm sure he'll be fine. Let's go home. And they're like, please, let's save it. Please, let's save it. Please, please, please. And I'm like, no. Like, we're not, like, there's no saving this thing. And they're like, please. And so I'm like, no. So we get in the car and we go home. And we get home and we made the mistake of telling Spurgeon and my wife, who are animal lovers. Look, I'm an animal lover too. They're delicious, but like they're animal lovers. Like they like you love these little animals, and so they're like we gotta go back to the park like right now. We gotta go back to the park. And so I'm like, all right, let's go back to the park. So we go back to the park, and we have like a little shoebox, and Spurgeon has his gloves on, and I see my son there in the dirt, stooping down gently, corralling this little bird, putting it into the box, bringing it home. My wife trying to like feed it with like a little tube of water. The kids going out and trying to scrounge up in the dirt, like the fingernails filled with mud, trying to scrounge up any worms they can find to take care of this little bird that I know has no hope at all. And sure enough, the kids go to bed, and I called Danielle later on because I was out. I was like, how's the little guy? And she's like, he has seen his last day. And so my kids were out, got up the next morning, and were told that the paramedics came and got him in the middle of the night to revive him. And so that's kind of how it went. And that's like, to me, like, I'm thinking about this story, this little teeny bird, like, there's no hope. Like, he's not grow up to be something beautiful, but he'll never grow up. Like, there's no hope for this bird. Like, we don't know exactly what led to the end before the resurrection, but we just know that it was the end. Like, dehydration, some type of injury, whatever it might be. And yet there was something very moving about seeing my kids who, I know we live in this day now where the human soul is valued in many ways even less than that of a bird or a dog or an animal. But there's something special about seeing your kids go out and gently try to lift this bird, to rescue, to give hope, and to dig in the ground with their hands, to try to conjure up food and sustenance and provision and protection for this little bird. And of course, my mind, this is where my mind always goes, perhaps yours goes here as well, that how much more moving is it that the Son of Righteousness condescended into the dirt and the chaos and the debris to bring healing and hope and reconciliation and life to a people who were without hope. And that's the story here. I mean, ultimately, that's the story. There's so many things we can learn, these different themes from the story. But ultimately, what we learn from the story is that the Father says, I'm satisfied. No more enmity. No more broken relationship between me and these rebels. Because my Son humbled himself and grants to them now the hope and life for their souls, for our souls that we desperately need. Let's pray.